They say every generation believes it has it harder than the last. But what if this time something truly shifted beneath the surface? Millennials were told they were special, that they could be anything, that the world was opening, expanding, glowing with possibility. Yet many grew up watching towers fall on live television, economies collapse overnight, promises quietly dissolve. How do you build confidence on unstable ground? How do you trust the future when the future keeps rewriting itself? This is not just a story about student debt or smartphones. It is about invisible psychological architecture, the silent pressure to perform, the quiet fear of falling behind, the constant comparison that hums in the background like distant machinery. Some call it entitlement, others call it fragility. But what if it is neither? What if it is adaptation? Today, this reflection explores the emotional blueprint of a generation shaped by instability, hyperconnection, and relentless expectation. Let's begin. This chapter explores the early emotional conditioning of millennials, raised on affirmation, ambition, and the idea that anything was possible. It examines the psychological impact of growing up surrounded by motivational language, expanding digital worlds, and constant encouragement. Beneath the surface of confidence, it begins to uncover the quiet pressure hidden inside limitless possibility. They were told they were extraordinary, not in whispers, not in moderation, but constantly. You can be anything. Follow your passion. The world is yours. These weren't just phrases, they were psychological seeds. And when you are young, seeds do not feel heavy. They feel like sunlight. Childhood for many millennials was bathed in encouragement. Schools emphasized self-esteem. Parents were more emotionally expressive than generations before. Participation was celebrated. Effort was applauded. The horizon felt wide, almost infinite. But what happens when possibility has no edges? When a child grows up believing the sky is not the limit, but merely the beginning? On the surface, it creates confidence. But beneath that confidence, something quieter begins to form. Expectation. You were not just allowed to dream, you were expected to. You were not just capable, you were special. And being special carries a subtle weight. Because if anything is possible, then failure becomes deeply personal. If the world is open, then stagnation feels like a flaw. If you can be anything, then being something ordinary feels like a betrayal. No one said this out loud, but it lived in the air. Millennials grew up alongside expanding technology, the early internet, search engines, global connection. Information was instant. Opportunities felt borderless. You could compare your small town to the entire world with one click. The message was clear. There is more out there. Go get it. But ambition, when placed in a developing nervous system, can become something else. Pressure. A child who is told they are limitless may begin to fear their own limits. And limits are human. It is easy to celebrate potential. It is harder to live inside it. Because potential is not stable, it is not grounded, it floats, it glows, it promises, but it does not guarantee. Imagine standing at the edge of an ocean that stretches endlessly in every direction. Beautiful, expansive, inviting. Now imagine being told you must learn to swim all of it. At first you feel empowered, then you feel small. This is the paradox of limitless encouragement. The previous generations were often shaped by restriction. Millennials were shaped by expansion. But expansion without structure can feel like standing in an open field with no map. You are free, but where do you go? In psychological terms, this early conditioning builds what is known as inflated possibility schemas. The mind internalizes the belief that extraordinary outcomes are not only achievable but expected. This can fuel motivation. It can create resilience. But it can also create chronic self-evaluation. Am I doing enough? Am I maximizing my potential? Am I wasting time? When success becomes identity, rest begins to feel like erosion. And so the blueprint quietly forms. High aspiration, high comparison, high self-awareness. a generation raised to believe in themselves, but also to constantly measure themselves. The glow of encouragement was real, the opportunities were real, but so was the invisible standard. You were not just growing up, you were growing upward, and upward has no ceiling. This chapter explores the collective shocks that shaped millennial psychology: terrorism, recession, job instability, and the collapse of long-promised security. It examines how repeated societal disruptions influence the nervous system, attachment to stability, and long-term trust in the future. Beneath ambition, a quiet vigilance begins to take root. There is a difference between reading about instability and watching it unfold in real time. Millennials did not inherit a slow transition. They inherited rupture. Just as the promise of limitless possibility was taking shape, something cracked. Towers fell, markets collapsed, jobs disappeared. And it all happened on screens. For the first time in history, a generation witnessed global crisis not through history books, but through live broadcasts. The world did not feel distant. It felt immediate, fragile. Security became something that could dissolve overnight. When you are young, your sense of safety is often borrowed from the stability of the world around you. You assume the systems are solid, the structure's permanent. But what happens when the foundation trembles before you even finish building your identity? Psychologically, repeated exposure to large-scale instability can create a background state of vigilance. Not panic, not constant fear, just watchfulness. A subtle readiness for the next disruption. The 2008 financial crisis arrived not as an abstract economic event, but as a personal one. Parents lost jobs, houses were foreclosed, college debt ballooned, promised career paths narrowed, the narrative shifted. You can be anything quietly turned into "be careful." This dual messaging creates tension inside the mind. Strive boldly, but expect collapse. Dream expansively, but prepare for loss. Over time, this contradiction begins to wire itself into the nervous system. It becomes a kind of emotional sediment, layers of uncertainty settling beneath ambition. In psychology, chronic unpredictability can influence attachment to the future. When stability feels unreliable, long-term planning begins to feel risky. Commitment can feel dangerous. Investment can feel like exposure. You may notice it in subtle ways. Hesitation before buying a home. Anxiety before changing careers. A quiet fear of committing too deeply to one path. Not because of weakness, but because the blueprint includes collapse. Growing up in collapse does not always produce visible trauma. Often it produces adaptability, flexibility, a capacity to pivot quickly. But adaptability has a cost. If you are always prepared for the ground to shift, your body never fully relaxes. There is a constant hum in the background, like machinery running behind the walls. This is why some millennials feel both ambitious and uneasy, confident and cautious, hopeful and skeptical. It is not contradiction. It is conditioning. The world taught resilience, but through rupture. And when you learn resilience through rupture, part of you continues scanning the horizon, waiting for the next tremor. Even in calm moments, the question lingers: is this stable? Or is this temporary? The promise of endless potential did not disappear. It simply became threaded with fragility. And so the blueprint deepened. Not just expansion, but uncertainty. Not just ambition, but vigilance. This chapter explores the psychological impact of growing up alongside social media and digital hypervisibility. It examines how constant exposure to curated success reshapes identity, self-worth, and belonging. Beneath connection, a quiet erosion begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. There was a time when comparison was local. You compared yourself to classmates, neighbors, colleagues. The circle was small, the mirrors were few, but then the mirrors multiplied. Suddenly you were no longer measuring yourself against a handful of people, but against thousands, millions, entire industries of curated perfection. And it happened quietly. At first, social media felt like expansion, connection, creativity, community. You could find your people, you could share your voice, you could belong. But belonging in a digital age comes with exposure. You do not just see others, you see their highlights, their promotions, their engagements, their travels, their transformations. And the human brain, ancient and wired for tribal survival, does not always distinguish between curated image and lived reality. It simply registers status. In psychological terms, now this activates upward social comparison, the tendency to evaluate yourself against those who appear more successful or more secure. Occasional comparison can inspire growth, but constant comparison erodes quietly. It becomes a background whisper. You are behind. You are late. You are not enough. The difficult part is that no one says this directly. There is no villain. There is only exposure. Millennials came of age during the rise of digital identity. Profiles became extensions of the self. Validation became quantifiable and likes, shares, comments. Approval transformed into numbers, and numbers feel objective. If a post receives little attention, it does not feel neutral. It feels personal. Over time, identity can begin to fragment. Who are you and who performs well online? Are you living or curating? Like there's a subtle exhaustion in being visible. Because visibility invites judgment, even if the judgment is silent. You may notice it as a quiet pressure to improve your life, not just for yourself, but for display. To make choices that photograph well. To measure milestones by how they appear. The paradox is painful. This is the most connected generation in history. And yet, loneliness statistics rise. Why? Because comparison can create distance. When you see others constantly advancing, your own progress feels slower. When everyone appears certain, your uncertainty feels abnormal. But uncertainty is human. The digital world simply magnifies it. And so the blueprint absorbs another layer. High exposure, high comparison, high self-consciousness. Not because you are fragile, but because you are visible. And constant visibility changes the nervous system. It sharpens awareness, it heightens self-monitoring. It creates a subtle performance loop, always adjusting, always refining. The glow of connection is real, but so is the erosion. Like river sediment slowly reshaping the shoreline, comparison does not destroy identity overnight. It smooths it, it thins it, it questions it. And sometimes you wake up unsure whether the pressure you feel is ambition or simply the weight of being watched. This chapter explores the rise of hustle culture, productivity identity, and the pressure to monetize passion. It examines the paradox of being deeply ambitious yet chronically tired. Beneath success, emotional depletion quietly accumulates, not as failure but as overextension. Somewhere along the way, rest became suspicious, not openly condemned, just subtly questioned. What are you working on? What's next? How are you leveling up? Achievement stopped being an event. It became a baseline. Millennials entered adulthood during an era that praised optimization, productivity apps, morning routines, side hustles, personal branding. The idea that every hobby could become income. Passion was no longer something you enjoyed, it was something you leveraged, and so the blueprint expanded again. You were not just encouraged to dream. You were encouraged to monetize the dream. Psychologically, this transforms intrinsic motivation into performance identity. When your worth begins to intertwine with output, slowing down feels dangerous. If you are not producing, are you falling behind? The nervous system begins to equate stillness with risk. You may notice it as guilt during rest, anxiety on quiet weekends, a subtle voice asking, "Shouldn't you be doing more?" This is not laziness, it is conditioning. Millennials were shaped by instability and comparison. Achievement became armor. If the world is unpredictable, perhaps competence will protect you. If others are advancing, perhaps effort will secure your place. But effort without boundary becomes erosion. Burnout does not arrive as drama. It arrives as dullness. Tasks that once felt exciting begin to feel heavy. Success feels brief, almost hollow. There is little time to savor it before the next goal appears. And goals multiply. The digital world amplifies this cycle. There is always someone building faster, scaling higher, announcing milestones in real time. The internal dialogue sharpens. If they can do it, oh, why can't you? But the body keeps score. Chronic striving activates stress pathways. Cortisol remains slightly elevated. Sleep becomes shallow. The mind races even in silence. Outwardly, this can look like ambition. Inwardly, it feels like running on sand. The paradox deepens. You are capable. You are driven. You are exhausted. Achievement once symbolized freedom. Now it sometimes feels like obligation. There is also a deeper fear beneath the hustle. If you stop, who are you? When identity is built around progress, pause can feel like disappearance. Without the forward motion, the self feels undefined. This is why exhaustion lingers even after milestones, because the blueprint does not only value success, it values momentum, and momentum is relentless. Yet beneath the fatigue, something quieter is forming. A question. King, is this pace sustainable? Is this success meaningful? Or is this simply survival in disguise? The promise of limitless potential has now matured into relentless expectation. Not from parents, not from teachers, from within. The blueprint is no longer external. It lives inside the voice that whispers, "Keep going," even when your body asks for stillness. This chapter explores the subtle shift happening within millennials. A growing awareness of emotional health, therapy culture, boundaries, and redefining success. It examines the tension between inherited scripts and emerging values. Beneath exhaustion and comparison, a quieter form of strength begins to surface. Something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. After years of striving, adapting, comparing, and enduring uncertainty, a different conversation began to emerge. One about boundaries, about mental health, about saying no without apology. Millennials became the generation that normalized therapy, that spoke openly about anxiety, that questioned toxic workplaces, that left jobs not only for higher pay, but for peace. To some, this looked like fragility. To others, like entitlement. But what if it was recalibration? When you grow up in instability and constant comparison, your nervous system eventually seeks equilibrium. It searches for ground that does not shift, for identity that does not depend on applause. And so the questions deepen. Is success only financial? Is ambition always healthy? Is exhaustion a badge of honor or a warning? Psychologically, this stage reflects cognitive restructuring. Old beliefs are examined. Internalized narratives are challenged. The blueprint is not destroyed. It is revised. You may notice it in subtle choices. Choosing flexibility over prestige. Choosing therapy over silent endurance. Choosing fewer friends, but deeper ones. Choosing rest, even when guilt lingers. This does not mean the pressure disappears. The conditioning remains. The comparison still hums. The vigilance still flickers. But awareness grows, and awareness changes everything. Because once you see the blueprint, you can begin to redraw parts of it. There is also grief in this recalibration. Grief for the certainty that never materialized. Grief for the version of success you once imagined. Grief for timelines that shifted. Yet within that grief, there is maturity. A generation beginning to define fulfillment on its own terms. Not as spectacle, not as performance, but as sustainability. Perhaps success is not constant expansion. Perhaps it is alignment. Perhaps stability is not found in systems. Perhaps it is built internally. This recalibration is quiet. It does not trend. It does not announce itself. It unfolds in therapy rooms, in honest conversations, in late-night reflections. It unfolds in the simple realization you do not have to outrun the world to deserve peace. The blueprint, once shaped by limitless potential and repeated collapse, is now encountering integration. ambition remains, resilience remains. But so does self-awareness, and self-awareness softens the edges of pressure. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually, ice like sediment settling in water that was once turbulent. This final chapter brings together the contradictions that define millennial psychology: resilient yet anxious, ambitious yet exhausted, connected yet lonely. It reframes these tensions not as dysfunction but as adaptation to unprecedented cultural conditions. The blueprint is not broken. It is complex. You are often described in extremes: too sensitive, too entitled, too anxious, too ambitious, but rarely understood. Because from the outside, contradiction looks like confusion. From the inside, it feels like survival. You were raised to believe in possibility, then taught to expect collapse, encouraged to shine, then exposed to endless comparison, driven to achieve, then quietly burned out. Of course, the blueprint feels layered, and of course, you carry both hope and hesitation. Psychologically, adaptation to unstable environments produces duality. The nervous system learns flexibility, but also caution. The mind learns ambition, but also self-monitoring. You can dream boldly and still question whether it will last. You can want connection deeply and still feel wary of exposure. You can strive for success and still crave simplicity. These are not flaws, they are responses. Responses to a world that shifted faster than any generation before. A world that digitized identity, financialized stability, globalized comparison. The human psyche evolved slowly, the environment did not, and so the blueprint adapted in real time. This is why resilience and anxiety coexist, why humor often masks exhaustion, why therapy feels normal, why vulnerability is spoken more openly, yet loneliness remains. There is strength in this complexity. Not loud strength, not heroic strength, but adaptive strength. The kind that pivots, the kind that questions inherited scripts, the kind that chooses recalibration over blind endurance. Hope remains, but it is cautious now. Ambition remains, but it is being redefined. Connection remains, but it seeks depth over display. Perhaps the millennial story is not about collapse, or entitlement, or fragility. Perhaps it is about navigating expansion without a map, about building identity in an era of exposure, about learning that limitless potential and human limitation can coexist. And maybe the most profound shift is this: you are beginning to understand that you do not have to prove your worth through constant motion. You can be ambitious and gentle, driven and reflective, hopeful and uncertain. The blueprint is not perfect, but it is evolving.